Welcome to Inherently Distinctive.
Hey everyone, welcome back to an all-new episode of Inherently Distinctive with attorney Mark Goodman. I'm your host, Mike Leon. Mark here is a Nevada-based intellectual property attorney who helps startups, creatives, and small business owners protect what they've built through smart trademark and patent strategy. Today's episode, we're joined by a special guest, Ted Sutton. Ted's out in Nevada, as well as he is a Nevada and Wyoming attorney who helps entrepreneurs and investors form and maintain LLCs and corporations that protect their assets and set them up for long-term success. So together, Mark and Ted are going to break down how to protect your ideas and your business from start to finish. It's good to see you guys as always. I want to get into this before we actually dive into the topic. Ted, we're introducing you here to the audience. Can you share a little bit about your background? What drew you to focus on business formation and asset protection?
Yeah. So many of you know my dad, Garrett Sutton. He's been a lawyer for 45 years. He has his business Corporate Direct, where we set up LLCs and corporations for people all across the country. He's been fortunate enough to be associated with Rich Dad and Robert Kiyosaki. And because of that, our business has fortunately grown from that. So when it comes to me, obviously I'm his son. When I went to college, I actually never wanted to be an attorney. I got my degree in mining engineering, of all things. And it was really interesting because the summer before I graduated, I worked at a mine in northern Chile. And it's in the driest place on earth. It's really remote. While I had a good time there for those 3 months, it made me realize that it wasn't the career path I wanted to take, just because you work in remote areas, you have to commute to and from your home. And so that kind of gave me pause there. When I graduated, my parents sat down and my dad said, "Look, Ted, you're not finding work. You don't necessarily like this field. What you could do is you could go to law school and eventually take over my practice." And I'm like, that never really occurred to me. So I thought about it for a few weeks, but ultimately I thought it was best for me. So I made that decision after I graduated college and never looked back. But the thing is my dad never pushed it on me. His parents pushed law school on him, but he never pushed it on me. So, it's interesting because I kind of came to that conclusion after being in college. And so but I made that decision. I went to law school and I haven't looked back since. So it's been a really interesting and unique journey for sure.
It's funny how we always follow our parents' footsteps eventually. Mark, let me turn to you because you've spent the career helping people protect their ideas and patents and trademarks. How does that process connect with Ted on what he does on the business formation side?
There's a lot of overlap and sort of synergy here. And I wanted to share a little bit about my relationship with Ted's firm and how that all started. I mean, I graduated law school back in 2005, ended up moving here to Reno, Nevada in 2007. And I just so happened to be thinking about once I started my own firm, I needed to form a corporation. And looking on the web and so forth. We did have the internet back then. It wasn't so sophisticated. But I'm like, wow, Garrett Sutton's firm. And I knew about him because I'd read Rich Dad, Poor Dad and his book, Own Your Own Corporation, already at that time. And I was a big fan of his work. And I'm like, wow, he's got to be the one to go to set up a corporation. And then when I went in there, my wife also at the same time formed her corporation. She's a dentist, right? And then we were both getting started around the same time. And then Garrett and I started talking and we agreed that, hey, I would just rent my office from him and do some projects for him. So I didn't have to pay rent the first year, right? Which was important starting out in a new law firm here, since this was a scratch start law firm. And it's become synergistic ever since, because folks that are interested in patents and trademarks, copyrights, intellectual property, they're almost always going to need to form an LLC or a corporation. And very often folks that are forming corporations and LLCs are going to want to look at trademark, patent, copyright, and other intellectual property. So we've had this type of relationship really for the last now 17 years since that time, and it's been awesome. I think that Garrett and Ted's firm is, I would have to say, probably my number one source of referrals. Right? I doubt I'm the number one source of referrals for them, but I certainly referred them a lot of business as well. So it's been, a very valuable business relationship and a lot of fun. So yeah, that's kind of where we started. And there's it's just something that people that are in the same area, they're going to need both services in almost all cases.
Yeah, yeah. Well, let's dive into the weeds on the services part. So I'll start with you, Mark. When someone first decides to launch a company, right, new product or maybe a brand idea, what tends to happen if they secure the IP, but they never actually form a legal entity?
Okay, so yeah, we do get this people when they're doing a full bootstrap startup, right? What do I do first? And I mean, here's some. Usually, if you have nothing, right? Here's the way I usually would approach this, right? And I'm open to Ted's input on here and what maybe is even better. But typically, if we're thinking about trademarks, I want to make sure that we have the entity formed before I file a trademark application. And this is because trademark applications need to be filed on behalf of the entity, person or corporation or LLC that is marketing the product or service out there, right? Or else you can have some problems. And so if you just file it in your own name, well, ultimately you can assign it to the company later, but then you're doing more legal work. You might forget to do that. You can have problems. For example, we talked about on this podcast a few episodes ago that there's actually case law where somebody filed a trademark application and it was just done for some reason in the name of the president of the corporation and not in the corporation's name, and it was held to be void. That's freaky, right? We don't want any part of that, right? So oftentimes when I'm working with somebody who's starting up a new business, I'll actually be on the phone with Ted's company and his staff and be like, okay, you guys email me when that entity's formed, and then I'm filing that trademark like within the next week, let's say. So that's the type of synergy that we have going.
Ted, anything to add on that?
Yeah, well, I think Mark hit on it. Is when you have assets like real estate, stocks, intellectual property, I think it's important to set up your LLC first before you buy or before you register your copyright or your trademark or any other intellectual property. The analogy I like to use is that when you set up your LLC, it's like the foundation for a house. You need to get the foundation right at the start, because if you don't, you're going to have problems later. So we see this issue a lot with real estate specifically, where people set up the LLC, but they don't transfer title of their property into it. The same principle applies with copyrights and trademarks. It's just important to have that LLC in place, because then when you file for the copyright or the trademark, you can file it in the name of the LLC and it can just go into that LLC. And, I know Mark mentioned that case where the president of a corporation used the trademark for his own individual purposes instead of for the company. So that's where you run into issues. It's just really, really crucial to have that LLC from the beginning, because when you do, you're going to avoid problems down the road.
Yeah. Ted, let me piggyback on that. How do you explain to them? You explained what an LLC is, but what about sole proprietorship or corporation or somebody that's just starting out? How do you explain the difference between these terms and which one they should venture in?
Yeah, so the sole proprietorship, it's a common, well, it's not really an entity. It's just where you're acting in your individual capacity and you start conducting business. So the sole proprietorship, it's not a filing. It's just where you conduct business and you don't do any sort of filings and you're doing it on your individual behalf. I recommend people stay away from sole proprietorships just because they offer zero liability protection. So if you have a coffee cart, for example, you just set up shop on the side of the street if you have a sole proprietorship and one of the patrons spills coffee on themselves, suffers some burns, they're coming after you personally. And so the sole proprietorship just doesn't offer any protection at all. When it comes to the corporation, that is an entity that you form with the Secretary of State. So you perform a filing, much like with an LLC. But with a corporation, there's not as much flexibility there. The LLC is nice because it offers tax flexibility, ownership flexibility, management flexibility. With a corporation, it's a little more rigid, and it can be good, if you want to take a company public, because you can have it taxed as a C Corp. So corporations are good. They're just not as flexible as LLCs. And specifically when it comes to intellectual property, we like using LLCs just because generally they're more passive in nature. And with an LLC, you could be taxed as a partnership or a disregarded entity, whereas with a corporation, you can't. And LLCs also offer the charging order protection. When you're personally sued, it makes it harder for creditors to reach the assets inside of them. So, there's a lot of different entity types out there, but when it comes down to holding assets like real estate, stocks, and intellectual property, in most cases, it's best to use an LLC.
Mark, let me ask you, and pivoting because we just touched on patent and trademarks. Who should actually own the patent and trademarks? You gave the example about the one in the business owner's name instead of the corporation. But for founders working together, though, like who should actually own the patent and trademarks?
Well, so there are some different structures you could look at. Now, for Ted and I talked about this a little bit before the show. It was a good topic to get into since we're both on this episode, right? Is that for trademarks and patents, I have a different approach as far as the corporate ownership. For patents, copyrights, trade secrets, and other assets, I often work with Ted's office to set an intellectual property holding LLC to simply hold these assets. So if you have a patent application, some copyrighted materials, some trade secret material, we can simply draft a contract that assigns it to this intellectual property holding LLC. And then we set up a licensing agreement, which is like a lease between the intellectual property holding LLC and another LLC that is going to be your operating company, right? The asset protection strategy, and this is something that Garrett and Ted's firm does all the time, is the idea is you want to separate the operation of the business with the holding and ownership of the assets for asset protection purposes. And I always use this example, I did it in the podcast earlier, is imagine if you're driving around town, Ted, and somebody rear ends you, right? Okay, you can sue them, right? And for the damages. Well, and what if they have a house? And I'm ignoring for now the homestead exemption, but you could take their house, right? But what if they're just renting a house? You can't take the house because they're just renting that house from someone else. They don't own it. It's not in their financial estate to be executed on. So similarly here, the idea with this structure is that if there's some disastrous lawsuit down the road, the lawsuit creditor is going to go after the operating company because that's whom they would have a claim against, right? And let's say it was an utter disaster, a huge judgment, right? Well, at least they couldn't go after the intellectual property holding LLC because they have no claim against the intellectual property holding LLC. And further, in all of our license agreements in this area, that would be a triggering event that would automatically terminate the license. And so you could at least rise back up without losing your patents and copyrights and so forth. The case law that I talked about before regarding trademark is why in my current practice, I don't advise this structure for if all you have is trademarks. Because trademarks are just different. They're always connected with who's selling the product in the market. And whenever you try to license or assign a trademark, you could just run into that issue. It can be done. I'm not saying this is a fatal flaw. To me, it's just not worth the risk of, when you try to enforce your trademark, a defendant coming back and saying, well, it's actually void because look at this assignment. It's not a real assignment. It's a naked assignment, or this license is invalid. There's just too many legal hurdles there. I'd rather just go simple there. File a trademark in the name of whatever company is marketing the service or product. But with patents, copyrights, and other stuff, it's a terrific asset protection strategy to set up this holding LLC and a license agreement.
Yeah. Ted, piggybacking on that, explain to us what asset protection really means in practice, especially I'm sure small businesses don't have a legal department.
Yeah. Well, that's why they have, some attorneys who can help. Other people use other services out there to sort of help with their business needs. But asset protection is kind of this amorphous concept. It has a lot of different meanings and connotations. A lot of them are unfortunately negative just because, there's people who sell you on asset protection strategies when in reality, they're the ones who are making a buck and giving you no protection in return. So what asset protection really is it's kind of like putting in roadblocks in place to prevent creditors from, collecting from your assets. So the more roadblocks you have in place, the better. And when it comes to using them to protect your business or your assets, usually that involves setting up LLCs to hold title to them. So, Mark talked about how for copyrights and patents, what you do is you set up a holding company for your intellectual property that's separate and apart from your operations. And so in effect, what that is that's just another roadblock in place to prevent creditors from reaching your assets. So if the creditor sues your business, they're only going after the operations company. But because your IP is in a separate holding company in Wyoming, it's out of reach, and so it's just it's an additional hurdle that's in place to prevent creditors from collecting from the things you value most.
Gents, as we wrap on this episode, Mark, I'll start with you. For anyone that's listening right now and they're ready to turn an idea into a real business, what piece of advice would you give them in terms of building that foundation the right way on day one?
So I think you just got to get good advice from respected professionals on this, right? Of course, Ted and I are good resources, or we're not the only ones, of course, but get the good advice. And I will say that and just get it out of the way so that you can focus on building a product or service or something that's gonna actually make money. And then I would also advise just remember to revisit the structure, because if the business grows, there may be more things you should be doing or different approaches you should be taking down the road. So don't just set it and forget it for years, right? Come back to your professionals and review this at least periodically, I would say.
Ted, what about you?
Well, I think there's two things. I think the first thing is if you're starting a business or you want to set up intellectual property, it's important to just take action. I mean, there's a lot of people out there where for them it's analysis by paralysis. Is this the right time? Should I do it? I think you just got to get out there and just start taking action. The second thing is that it's really important to surround yourself with team members who know what they're doing and who can give you good advice. So Mark and I have a good relationship. We refer IP work to him. He refers asset protection work to us. It's important to have us two. It's important to have a CPA on your team, a bookkeeper, any other things that relate to your field. So I think, surrounding yourselves with people who can help you with your business and your IP is definitely key, and it'll help you in the future.
Gents, thanks for the time and insights on this. Truly appreciate it, as always.
Awesome. This was great.
Awesome. Thanks, Mike.
And thank you to everybody out there listening to today's episode of Inherently Distinctive. Big thank you to Ted Sutton for being here today. You want to learn more about protecting your ideas, inventions, and brands, do me a favor, visit goodmanlawnevada.com to learn more about Ted's work in business formation, asset protection. Like he mentioned, visit sutlaw.com. Don't forget to like, subscribe, leave a review and comment, or share this episode with someone who needs to hear it. As always, I'm Mike Leon. We'll see everybody next time.
Thanks for watching. Be sure to hit that like and subscribe button and leave us a review in the comments.